The following is a video presentation of Crossroads Bible Church, San Jose, California. The current sermon series is entitled, The City of God.
Well, yes, my name is Jeff, and as Ryan mentioned, we're in the second week of a series which is really going to be pivotal for us as a church. Give our students a round of applause. Next week, we are in the second week of this series titled The City of God. And if you step back and you look at the scriptures from a 30,000-foot perspective, you're going to see this kind of come up over and over. We looked last week in Jeremiah 29, how when Israel was carted off to Babylon, God didn't say, hey, don't stay outside the city, don't cloister, don't fear so much cultural assimilation. Rather, go into the city, be unique there, but work for the good of the city. Pray for it, work for it, have sons and daughters plant gardens. Because if the city prospers, you too will prosper. This week, we're going to be looking at the gospel. The gospel is, it's foundational. It's foundational. And look, there are some folks that think the gospel is the initial set of propositional truths that you need to consider, understand, and accept in order to be a Christian, and then you graduate beyond that to some kind of deeper thing. You study Hebrew or something. No, the gospel is not the ABCs of the Christian faith. It's the A through Z of the Christian faith. You never move past it. So I want to take a look today at a passage of Scripture. It's one of the places that is probably the most illustrative of the gospel and its various facets. And it's in Luke chapter 15. We're going to be looking at the story of the prodigal son. And I would invite you all to stand with me for the reading of God's word. We're going to look at verses 1 and 2 and then 11 through 13. If you would like, the words are going to be on the screen behind me. Feel free to follow along. Now, the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." Verse 11, Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and here I am starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants." So he got up and went to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But the father said to his servants, "Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He who was lost and is found." So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of his servants and asked him what was going on. "Your brother has come," he replied, "and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has him back safe and sound." The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him, but he answered his father, "Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him?" "My son," the father said, "you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He who was lost and is found." This is the word of the Lord. Please be seated. This passage shows us that all of the ideas that anyone has ever had about how to connect with God are wrong. Now, this is fascinating. The Greco-Roman people of that time, they called the Christians they believe this, that you don't get to God through your an earned salvation paradigm where I'm going to do enough good stuff and now God's going to be pleased with me. You get there rather because Jesus saved you. In your sin, he died for you. And because of that, now you can have a relationship with God, not as a creation, but as a child. This was so otherworldly. In the first century, the Greeks and the Romans looked at Christians, you know what they called them? Atheists. They called them atheists because this is no kind of religion at all. This is some anti-religion. So this is absolutely preposterous. What Jesus is saying here is that all the ideas for how people are going to connect with the divine were categorically wrong. And he does this through this incredible, it almost reads like a play in which there are two acts. And act one is about the younger brother. Right. Let's take a look. He starts with a speech, right? And it's in verse 12. He says, the younger one said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." And so what happens? Well, in that time, they practiced something called primogeniture. It's where the older brother, he got the majority of the estate. So in Israel, it was 2/3. If you were the older brother, you would get 2/3 of the estate, and the younger brother would get 1/3 of the estate. Now, to ask your father for his inheritance before he was actually dead would have been absolutely astounding. The original hearers of this would have been aghast. I kind of picture, and you do if you read verses 1 and 2, you realize that Jesus is telling this story and there's people looking on. They're Pharisees and tax collectors, these two really distinct groups. Just put a mental pin in that. We're going to come back to it. And Jesus is telling this story. You got to imagine that the people hearing this were like, he said, what? This younger brother said to the father, "Give me my inheritance," which would have been the equivalent of saying, like, "I wish you were dead." In fact, one commentator who knows something about first century Israeli cultures and practices said to ask for the inheritance while the father is still alive is to wish him dead. He's saying, look, I don't want you. I don't love you. I want your stuff. I want your stuff. The same commentator said this. He said, a traditional Middle Eastern father could only be expected to respond in one way. He would be expected to drive the younger son from his house with verbal and physical blows. This kind of reminds me of my childhood. Anybody else? But that would have been absolutely what's expected here. It would have been unconscionable to tell the father, like, yeah, I wish you were dead. Can you just give me my inheritance now so I can leave and have you out of my life? Can you imagine? Can you imagine the dagger that must have been to his heart, right? And then the second half of the verse said that he divided his property between them. That word in Greek is bios. It's the same word we use for life. And we don't really get the connection between a person's identity and his land the way that you would in an ancient agrarian culture, but that was his livelihood, his inheritance, his family's legacy would have all been tied up in that land. In order to give his son the 1/3 that he would have given to the younger of the two brothers, he would have had to sell 1/3 of his property. Can you imagine? This had probably been in his family for years and years. It would have been the thing that successive generations were dependent upon. Yet he's going to sell it and give it to his son, and he lets his son go, which is fascinating. But you've got to understand, this father, he's dealing with rejected love. Rejected love. Now, I want to stop for a second and just consider that. I was trying to think of an example. The very first time I experienced this, I was in 4th grade. And we had one of those school field trips, and it was to the roller rink. Anybody remember the roller rink? They have those out here, right? The kids today, they're missing out on their Fortnite. I wish they had the roller rink, you know? But we took a trip, and there's this one. I don't know if your roller rink was like my roller rink, but there's one song where it's the couple song, and you got to hold somebody's hand, and you got to roller skate around. Is this just me? All right, well, just go with me on it, okay? So there was this girl in my 4th grade class. Sorry, babe, I didn't clear this with you. I'm not going to give you her last name, Kristen something, and she had pigtails, you know, and I wrote a little note, will you go to the roller thing with me? Yes for, check for yes or no, and I thought it was a lock. I mean, what's not to like? And so, she promptly checked the no box and gave it back to me, and I thought, And like daggers. Like, I don't, to this day, my self-esteem hasn't completely recovered. And I'm being kind of comical, but you know when that happens on a grander scale, it's the most painful thing in the universe. When you love somebody and they reject it. When you give your heart to somebody and they step on it. And parents, if you've had a kid walk out the door and never want to talk to you again, or if you've had a romantic relationship or even a spouse do that, you know. It's the most painful thing in the world. And this son says to the father, I don't love you. I love your stuff. Just give it to me so I can live a life apart from you. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the pain of the father? And what happens when somebody does that to you is it usually diminishes your affections for that person, right? There's the anger and the disgust, but eventually you write that person off and you marginalize them and you decide they're actually crummy and you didn't really like them anyway, right? It diminishes your affections. But not in this case. In this case, the father endures, he doesn't withdraw his love, but then the son comes back. The son comes back. What does the text say? He went and he engaged in wild living, prostitutes and so on. Then he ends up feeding pigs. No good Jew wants to be feeding pigs, right? And then he says, wouldn't I be treated better in my father's house? So we don't know exactly where he went, but he ends up making his way back to his father's house. And the text says the father saw him while he was still a long way off. And he invites him in. And the father runs to meet him. The son has this restitution plan that apparently he's kind of concocted on. He realizes what he's done. He knows what he's done is probably one of the most cruel, one of the most cold gestures a son could ever make towards his father. So he has a plan. In fact, the rabbis taught in order to get back in the good graces of your community, you would pay some kind of restitution. So as the son runs up to the father, the son's trying to roll out this plan. He's got like a PowerPoint. He says, well, here's what I'm going to do. He said, don't take me back in as your son. Rather, I can work with some of your hired hands. Now, that's significant. If you were a slave in that place and time, this is probably a wealthy patriarch. You can kind of tell. It's hanging in the margins. If you were a slave in that time, don't think of what you think of when you think of like the Americans, the transatlantic slave trade. Slaves in the first century were more akin to indentured servants. A lot of them were more educated than their masters. A lot of them enjoyed a lot of freedoms and liberties and so forth. Slaves lived on the estate. The craftsmen were hired hands. They lived out in town. So what the son here is proposing, he's like, look, if I indenture myself to one of these craftsmen, I'm not even going to live on the estate. I'm not even going to live near you. I'll live out in town. I'll live in somebody's shed, but maybe I'll make enough money to begin to pay you restitution. That's what the younger son's saying. And the father has none of it. Before he's even done articulating this plan, the father does what? Well, first of all, he runs to meet him. He runs to meet him. Now, this is significant because first century Jewish patriarchs do not run. Kids run, women run, and in fact, some commentators say he's not acting like a father. He's not acting like the patriarch of the family here. He's actually acting like a mother. But he becomes undignified. You had to lift up, in the King James, they say, gird up your loins. But that's just simply lifting up the edge of your robe so you could run. He would bare his legs. That's shameful. Patriarchs don't do that kind of thing, but he does it. And he runs to meet him. He covers the distance. And when he gets there, he kisses him. And the son tries to roll out the plan. The father says, no. Get my robe, the most expensive robe in the house, and cover his nakedness, and cover his disgrace, and cover his shame. You thought you were going to earn your way back in, but I'm going to take care of every last bit of it. You're in, you're mine. This is what the father shows us. Now, then it goes to Act 2, the older brother. And the older brother, it's this interesting, verse 25 is where the break is. And it says this, meanwhile, the older son was in the field. And he came near the house when he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him, what's going on? Your brother has come, he replied. And your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. Apparently this calf is a big deal. This ends up being kind of the division between the older brother and the younger. It's about this calf. Now, to us, that doesn't mean a lot. But in the first century, meat was very hard to come by. You would probably only eat it once or twice a year, maybe at one of the high holidays, these big celebrations. And the fatted calf was the best possible meat you could have. And in fact, so the commentators say there's no way that a family in those days would have thrown a private party where a fatted calf was the main course. That was unheard of. That would have been like solely for like big public celebrations or like weddings or something like that. Yet this is exactly what the father does. And the older brother is concerned about the cost. He says, "How dare you use our wealth this way? How dare you?" He's indignant. What he's really saying is this: I have rights over your things. I have rights over your things. Are you crazy? This is over the top. How could you possibly do this? This is insane. This is disproportional. This is he was a crummy son. He left. And so the brother's incensed. How could you possibly do this? And then in verse 28, he says, verse 29, he said, "But he answered his father, Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders." He doesn't call him by his name. That's significant. If you were, it would have been like most excellent father or something like that. There would have been a very proper and cordial relationship here. But to address his father, and what he's saying here is, look you. He doesn't even call him by his name. And he's throwing the most incredible party of his life, and the son refuses to go in. Now, what would have generally happened in an ancient Near Eastern family at this point is he would have had his son stripped naked, beaten, and incarcerated. That's what the commentators say. This is absolutely an egregious offense. This is unconscionable. Nobody would do this, yet the older brother is doing just that. He's saying, look, I can't believe you're extending this kind of love and affection to somebody who just left, who abandoned you. But instead of beating him, right, what does the father do? He keeps entreating him, come into the feast. And how does the story end? Does everybody forgive each other? Did they kind of coalesce into a nuclear family unit again? We don't know. Jesus left the story. He left us hanging. It's a cliffhanger. You don't get to find out. But this shows us three things, at least three things. This revolutionizes our understanding of sin, revolutionizes our understanding of who God is, and salvation. So let's take them one at a time. Let's take a look at God. Jesus is the first one. You see God being addressed in a couple of instances in the Old Testament as Father, but Jesus addresses God as Father almost universally in every place in the New Testament except for one. Now, that's challenging for a lot of people. I read a statistic years ago, and I don't want to butcher it, but it was something to the effect that the vast majority of atheists have some kind of a negative relationship with their biological father. And when you say father, it conjures things, doesn't it? Isn't that patriarchal? Why is God a father? Because we like to impose our view of father onto God. What Jesus is saying here is his father is like no father you've ever seen. It's like no earthly father you've ever encountered. And Jesus defines what he means. Like, look, my dad was, he was the child of German immigrants. He grew up in Queens in the 50s, and he was a naval officer. Am I painting a picture here? The man was stern, okay? In fact, when we had to clean our rooms on Saturday, he had white gloves, white gloves. And I love my dad. He's a sweet guy. No, he's not that sweet. He's a surly, old German guy, And I think when most of us think of God as our father, we tend to impose that construct on him. And Jesus is saying, look, everybody wants a father who's loving and kind and sincere, forgiving, sensitive. Jesus is saying, that's exactly who my father is. Your earthly father may not have been like that, but your Father in heaven is loving and kind and patient in a way that you probably can't conceive. He shows us that there's a Father unlike any other father, and for all his power and his majesty, he's still willing to receive back these two sons who have both rejected his love. Now, sin. Act 1, we've got what I'll call the predictable sin. This is the younger brother. When you think of sin, this is probably what you're thinking about, right? This younger brother who goes off and he squanders his money in wild living, and we find out it's prostitutes and who knows what else, right? Wild living. Go ahead and infer whatever you want there. It's probably true. I asked my son Caleb this morning as I was riding the bike at like 6:30 or something like that, and he comes in and he stands next to me. He's just watching me. He must be a sight to behold. And he's standing there, and I'm telling him the story. I tell him the story of Luke, in Luke 15, the prodigal son. Now there's two brothers, and I asked him at the end, I said, Caleb, which one was the sinner? And he says, it was the younger brother. It was the younger brother. And I think that's what most people think. They read the story, and of course it's the younger brother. He went off, and isn't the father magnanimous for accepting him back? But the reality here is that Acts 2 of this, the older brother, you have the predictable sin, then you have the insidious sin. And the reality is they both used God to get what they wanted. The younger brother wanted the inheritance. He wanted self-discovery. I'm going to move to some far-off land and do whatever I feel like. And the older brother did very much the same thing. Through his obedience, through his moralism, he went to the father and said, look, haven't I been great? Don't you owe me? And so do you see, both the older brother and the younger brother are both sinning against God in that they don't love him for him, they love him for what he can provide. They love him for his stuff. And in the end, we find out it's actually the moralistic older brother who's the one who's lost. We don't actually get to see the resolution of the story. We don't know if he comes to his senses and repents and asks the Father's forgiveness and goes into the feast. He leaves it a cliffhanger because I think it's to enunciate the fact that it's the older brother, the moralistic, the religious one who's hopelessly lost. Now you gotta back up to verses 1 and 2. And remember I told you to put a pin in it earlier. And this is why we read it. It says, now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus. There's two distinct groups of people here. Tax collectors. Let's do a little history. Tax collectors, I picture a guy in a cheap suit with a pocket protector and some glasses, right? Does anybody else get that? I picture an IRS guy, right? That's not exactly what's in view here. Tax collectors in first century Israel, what happened was they owed the Roman government their pound of flesh, and then they owed Herod yet another pound of flesh. Some scholars have theorized that the ancient Israelites in and around Jerusalem were taxed up to 90% of their income. And so you go out and you catch 10 fish, 9 of them are going somewhere else, right? Tax collectors were the people responsible for the collection, all right? This isn't so much IRS as it is like Tony Soprano. I don't know if that helps you at all. Right? So these are ethnic Jews who are now in the employ of Herod and the Romans, depriving their brothers and sisters, the other Israelites, of their hard-earned money, fish, pottery, whatever it was. They were interlopers. They were traitors. They were the most reviled people in all of Israel, yet we got them on one side. And then we got the Pharisees on the other side. Pharisees were one of 3 religious sects in the first century. They were the ones who had the dominant political party, if you will. And Jesus has harsh rebukes for them through the New Testament, but they are the religious elite. They are the legalists. They are the moralists. He's telling this story. There was a father who had 2 brothers. Do you see what's going on here? The younger brother, of course, is the tax collectors. These people are obviously sinful. Of course, yeah, that's a big, obvious red-letter sin. You know, going off, spending your father's inheritance on prostitutes. But, as it turns out, it's this other group of people, these moralistic Pharisees, that Jesus levies the harshest criticism at. So sin, as it turns out, isn't just the younger brother set. It's the older brother set too. In fact, there's 2 things in view here. One is legalism, and the other is licentiousness. And the world says, and religion, by and large, says, it's the moral who are in and the immoral who are out. Jesus says it's the humble who are in and the proud who are out. What this parable is saying is striking. It's saying if you are thoroughly aware of the fact that you are on the wrong side of the divide, you are precisely the person that Jesus can help. But if you're standing there and you don't think you're on the wrong side of the divide, then you're precisely what the older brother was. And this has got to cut us to the core. They all, both the older brother and the younger brother, weren't interested in the father for who the father was. They were interested in the father for his stuff. So the challenge for us then becomes, how can we love God without an agenda? Third point, what does this passage teach us about salvation? There's this John Newton who wrote Amazing Grace. He wrote another hymn, and it goes like this: our pleasure and our duty, though opposite before, since we have seen his beauty, are joined to part no more. William Cowper, another writer, writes, to see the law of Christ fulfilled and hear his pardoning voice changes a slave into a child and a duty into a choice. It turns out what we see here in this passage, this is exactly what the younger brother receives from the father. Unmitigated grace and mercy. All right? The title of this story is The Prodigal Son. I've got a couple of issues with that, all right? One, everybody assumes it's about this wayward son. Yeah, you shouldn't do that. You shouldn't go off and squander your money on prostitutes, okay? It's about two lost sons. It shouldn't. And the word prodigal, interestingly enough, Christians will frequently use this as a noun. Ryan and I both have our undergrads in English, and it drives us crazy. A prodigal, you'll see, they had a freshman kid who went off and had a crazy year at state school. Oh, she's a prodigal, right? The prodigal in this story should refer to God. The word prodigal means abounding, over and above, like lavish. The celebration that the father calls for when the son comes home, it's over the top. It's totally disproportional to who he is and what he did. It's prodigal. This story here, it's about a prodigal God. In fact, if you want to take your study of this deeper, I want to commend a book to you, Prodigal God by Tim Keller. The book is all about Luke 15, the gospel. So not every book I quote is like a great read. This one's fantastic, and I want to commend it to you. But the father's love is over the top. And the story is really about two brothers who were both sinful and lost. A couple of things you've got to realize if you're going to see his beauty. God, our salvation is something that God initiates. If you are here and you believe that Jesus is the Son of God and that he rose from the dead and that he paid the price for your sins on the cross, is because God initiated that. And if you're here today and you're still wrestling with a lot of this and you're trying to figure out how it all works, it's because God initiated it. God works providentially through people and circumstances, and he chooses people and he calls them to himself with irresistible grace. In both of these cases, the father, what does the text say? It says, well, he was still a long way off. The father saw him, which kind of paints a picture. And you don't want to read too much into it because it's a parable and not a narrative, but you have to imagine, in order to see him a long way off, the father probably walked to the highest point in his property and looked. And then when he saw him, what does he do? He picks up his robe and he runs to meet him. He covers the distance. The same thing with the older brother. The older brother is standing outside the feast, the greatest party the father has ever thrown, and he's indignant. He refuses to go in, and then he's got a gripe about the fatted calf, and he says, why couldn't you just give me a goat? Which sounds absurd to us, but now that you know the context, you know what he's asking for. He just wanted the father's stuff. But the father goes to meet him. And instead of having him beaten and locked up, he invites him in. The Father is the one who initiates it. God initiates our salvation. He goes out to both the older brother and the younger brother. And you will never seek him until he seeks you. You have to have something that melts your heart. Because when you see, and here's the reality, all of us were either younger brothers or older brothers. And a lot of us, once we become Christians, we're still older brother-ish and younger brother-ish. And you've got to wrestle with the categories of your own bondage and figure out exactly where you fall in this. But you have to know this. That until you see what Jesus did on the cross, everything I'm talking about, serving God with your whole heart, working for the good of a city, giving your time and treasure and talent for the kingdom so Jesus' name can get spread, it will all seem like a burden. It will all seem like a burden until you understand what God did for you, and then that you see the beauty of it, and something changes. I want to draw this out in verse 31. Something really interesting. He says this. We'll start in verse 30. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fatted calf for him. And in verse 31 he says, my son, the father said, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. It's literally true. Everything, because the father already gave a third of his inheritance away to his son who squandered it. So the only remaining wealth this family had were the two-thirds that the older son would have been entitled to. And the older son, now you kind of understand what he's getting at. Wait a minute, you're killing the fattened calf, my shares are going down. Right? This is all of a sudden, this is cutting into his slice of the pie. And what's interesting is the older brother doesn't refer to the younger brother as my brother. He's like your son. It's that one, right? He wants a degree of separation there. I'm not putting my lot in with him. He's your son. But then the father says to the older brother, everything I have is yours. And you see what? You see a crummy older brother, right? What's a good older brother? I was the oldest brother, and so I will acknowledge in front of this host of witnesses, I wasn't the best big brother. If my brother and sister were here, they'd tell you horrible things I did to them that I've completely forgotten about. But I remember enough of them. But there are my finer moments as a big brother. What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to protect your little brother and sister. If they get into trouble, you're supposed to go handle it. If your mom and dad aren't around, you're kind of the proxy, right? You're supposed to look out for your siblings. You're the big brother. I can't tell you how many fights I got in because of my little brother. He was this little trash-talking 90-pound kid. You know, it was a busy time. This older brother is crummy. He's not going to lift a finger. He's not going to go and follow him to that foreign land and figure out where he is in his shame and his nakedness and pick him up and clean him off. He's not going to help him make his way back into the family's graces. And he's indignant when that happens because he's really concerned about his inheritance. We have an older brother in Jesus who didn't consider his inheritance, rather he laid it down. He gave it up completely. And when we come to him disgusting and dirty and filthy, he wraps a robe around us and he makes us his. He kisses us. He doesn't make us jump through a whole bunch of hoops to get back into God's grace. He says, take the free gift that I am offering you through my blood and you're in. I'll kill the fatted calf. We'll have a feast that the world has never seen. And what does he do? He initiates it. He bridges the gap. We have an older brother in Jesus who on the cross said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He forsook his heavenly family. Why? So that we could have it. So that we could have it. And when you get a hold of that, he was stripped and endured shame so that we could be clothed in God's honor. And when you get a hold of that, something has to change inside you. It stops being about religion, first of all. The ancient Greeks and the Romans were right. This is a religion. Religion, the default state of every religion which has ever surfaced is I'm going to do some stuff in order to get God to be pleased with me. This is the gospel, and the gospel's translated good news. It's good news. Something already happened. Now you have to respond to it. He brought us home at the greatest expense to himself. And when you see that beauty, now your heart can be changed. Now you don't give and serve out of a sense of duty or like I'm trying to earn something. I'm trying to somehow balance the cosmic scales of justice on my own. You see that Jesus did it all at the greatest cost to himself. And that all of us, older brothers, all of us younger brothers, we're all equally lost. And I think it's the great temptation for the older brothers of the world to say, look, it's the younger brothers. And it's a temptation for the younger brothers to look at the older brothers of the world and say, it's the older brothers. And we do this perpetually, right? It's the traditionalists or the these new age people. These people are blue states and red states. It's those people over there. They're the trouble. Jesus says, look, you're all in trouble. But I love you all, older brothers and younger brothers. Come to me. I will wrap my robe around you. I will kiss you. I will throw a feast for you. I will cover the distance. I will pay for the sin. And you'll have a pardon that nothing can impede. And I'm going to do it all. I'm going to pay for it all with my blood. And this is the gospel. Let me pray. Lord, thank you for your word today, God. Lord, I do pray for Crossroads that we be a church that understands what you did for us. We understand the gospel. That it's good news. That you suffered and died. That you were laid in a borrowed tomb. But you conquered sin and you conquered death in order to make a way for us to go home. We praise you for this, and we praise you for the cross. And we pray it all in Jesus' name. Everybody said, amen.